Hello, good afternoon to viewers watching here in the UK. Hello to viewers right around the world, and welcome to this BBC News Facebook Live, which is coming to you live from the BBC Weather Centre. My name is Ben Rich. I'm one of the weather presenters here, and we have been following very closely the progress of Hurricane Irma over the last week or so, really, as it's ploughed across the Caribbean. And of course, as we've been seeing so widely in the news coverage, the problems it has been causing across Florida. Now, Hurricane Irma has come a very long way. It has travelled about 3,700 miles. It's close to 6,000 kilometres across the Atlantic. It was at hurricane strength for over 11 days, and at its peak, Irma brought sustained winds of up to 185 miles per hour, just shy of 300 kilometers per hour as it moved in across the Caribbean. Now, Irma, since then, has weakened as it's been moving across Florida. It has been downgraded just in the last couple of hours. It is now classified as a tropical storm, but still bringing sustained winds, steady winds of around 70 miles per hour. Huge amounts of rain. Some parts of Florida have seen 400 millimeters of rain. A storm surge which has caused major issues, some tornadoes as well. And this storm system continues to move northwards. Now, over the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, we'll hopefully be talking to somebody who has been in the United States, who can tell us a little bit about what it was like to experience and to track Hurricane Irma. And we will also, hopefully, answer some of your questions. So if you do have any questions or comments, if you've been in Irma's path and you're watching us and you want to tell us what it was like, feel free to get in touch in the comments underneath. So let's take a look at Irma's progress. And like many Atlantic hurricanes, it began life across Africa. These big storm clouds, which have brought a lot of flooding actually across central areas of Africa, can move out into the very warm waters of the Atlantic and spin up, if the conditions are right, into hurricanes. And that is exactly what happened with Irma around 11 days ago or so. Now, watch what happened as we track its progress across the Atlantic. This storm, this lump of cloud here on the satellite picture, became more organized. You can see it almost looking more angry. The eye of the storm appears just as it gets towards Barbuda, where, of course, it made landfall and brought sustained winds of around 185 miles per hour. Powerful Category 5 hurricane. It then moved its way westwards across the Caribbean, weakened a little bit before making landfall across the Florida Keys, but still just about a Category 4 hurricane. But since then, notice the storm is no longer that nice, clean clump of cloud. It's become more ragged. It's broken apart, and that's because the storm system has run over the land, which has weakened it significantly. It needs the warm waters of the ocean to retain its strength, and as it's moved over the land, the storm has weakened, but still bringing some strong winds and huge amounts of rain. This is the rainfall radar. You can see the green and yellow colors moving northwards across Florida. And actually, although the storm center is currently sitting just about here, the north of the Florida peninsula, you can see that the rain is extending quite a long way ahead of it up into Georgia, parts of South Carolina, for example. Some spots down towards southeast of Florida have recorded 400 millimeters of rain. We could see totals close to that, even quite a lot further north. And as we go through the next 24 hours or so, our storm system, in an increasingly weak form, will push its way northwards, spreading rain with it, and the weather will get better across Florida. However, I do have to talk about one other storm that we're keeping a very close eye on, because Irma was not alone in the Caribbean. We've also spun up this, Hurricane Jose. Now, currently a Category 2 hurricane, not as strong as Irma was, but it's passed quite close to some of the Caribbean islands, now meandering quite aimlessly in the Atlantic. But we're watching this one closely because some forecasts over the coming days, some, I should stress, not all, but some do take it back towards, say, the Bahamas, maybe Cuba, maybe Florida, so we'll be keeping a very close eye on that one. Now, as I mentioned, feel free to send us your questions. They'll come through to me here on the phone, and I'll try and answer as many of them as I can. But before we do that, I want to talk to Michael Phelps, who should be with us on the phone. Michael is a meteorologist at Storm Mapping. And just tell us, first of all, where you are right now, Michael.
Well, Ben, we're right now in near Atlanta, Georgia. This is where I live, and we basically followed Irma up from Florida, and we've relocated to North Georgia, knowing that this part of Georgia could see some pretty nasty weather later on this afternoon. So we're kind of re-establishing a new position here in North Georgia, and we're going to cover the flooding and the tornado possibilities with Irma.
Talk us through what the last 24 hours or so have been like for you. What have you been doing? Where have you been?
Well, we started out on the east coast of Florida. We started out around Melbourne, Florida, which is north of Miami. Some of the earlier forecast models had showed Irma affecting that area, but it became pretty clear the day before yesterday that this was going to be more of a west coast of Florida storm. So we relocated yesterday to Naples and got there about, I'd say about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were able to scout out a good location to watch the landfall of Irma from a strong reinforced parking garage. Those are excellent shelters for folks who want to view these things, like storm chasers and researchers wanting to view these storms coming in. You need a real strong structure that gets you above the storm surge, and that was a high enough structure and strong enough to do that. So we rode out the storm in Naples in that parking garage, and we were able to get some pretty dramatic footage of the hurricane making landfall there, first in Marco Island, but then where we were in Naples a couple of hours later.
As far as you could tell, had people in that part of Florida heeded the warnings to evacuate?
Oh, yes. As we were coming down from Georgia, there were thousands of vehicles northbound on the interstates and only just a few vehicles going southbound. So there was a mass evacuation from the state of Florida. And then when they issued the warnings on the West Coast the day before yesterday, there was a mass evacuation from the West Coast. When we were in Naples yesterday, we saw no locals. There were no locals anywhere in Naples. It was a ghost town. The only people there were media and researchers and storm chasers.
Now, for those of us who have never experienced firsthand the power of one of these storms, tell us a little bit about what it feels like to be in the path of a hurricane like this.
It's frightening. I mean, even for seasoned veterans, meteorologists and storm chasers and researchers like us, it's still kind of frightening. I mean, it rains, it pours, the wind howls, and it gets stronger and stronger and stronger over a very long period of time. And that can start playing, mind games with you. I mean, you start going crazy almost, listening to the sound and fury of that hurricane. And then when the eye wall hits, it is like, for example, yesterday when the eye wall hit, it was almost an hour of just pure wind and fury. I mean, it was blinding rain. You couldn't see more than 10 or 15 feet in front of you. The wind was blowing up to 142 miles an hour. That was the recorded gust at the airport, which was just a little over a mile from where we were in Naples. And it was just crazy. And then just like that, you get the eye of the hurricane that comes over, and you go from this just horrible wind and rain and sound to absolute silence, a dead calm wind, and there are birds flying around in the eye of the hurricane. It's just an incredible experience. It really shows you the fury of nature, and it really makes you feel small in comparison.
Florida's not unused to hurricanes. They are a fairly frequent phenomenon, I suppose. But what was different about this one?
Well, this one had set records. I mean, it started out way out in the Atlantic, as you had mentioned, and for hurricanes to become named storms that early on and that far out in the Atlantic, only 5% of those ever end up hitting the United States. And this one was dead set on a track directly into the United States from the get-go. I mean, it was pretty clear it was going to be a major threat to the United States. So in that regard, it was a fairly rare hurricane. It had attained Category 5 status and kept that 185-mile-an-hour wind for over 36 hours straight, which also was a record for anywhere, even in the Pacific. This storm mimicked something that you would see in the Pacific Ocean, not the Atlantic Ocean. We really didn't think hurricanes could get that strong and stay that strong in the Atlantic for that amount of time, and so it's unusual in the fact that it didn't really follow a lot of the rules of typical Atlantic Basin hurricanes. And thankfully, it weakened as it came. It made a brush with Cuba and the landmass, and that weakened it, and it never was able to really regain its incredible strength when it hit Florida. because if it had, there would have been a massive storm surge, and there would have been incredible wind damage. And thankfully, it was just below that threshold when it hit Florida.
Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, despite the pictures we're seeing, Florida actually had something of an escape, you're saying?
Absolutely. They dodged a major bullet. I mean, yeah, the damage was pretty severe and extensive, and there was flooding and a major surge, especially on the East Coast. But in terms of what it could have been, yeah, they really got lucky.
Okay, well, we're talking to Michael Phelps, who is a meteorologist at Storm Mapping. He's talking to us from Georgia at the moment. While we're talking, I'm just going to run for our viewers who are just joining us the satellite sequence that shows how Irma formed and how it moved across the Atlantic. And we've had some questions. Keep them coming as well. So I'm going to put some of those to Michael. And first of all, Helen asks, how accurate can you be when you're tracking a hurricane?
Well, Helen, hurricanes are very difficult to forecast. You know, as a meteorologist, we want to try to do our best and feel like that we're really good at our craft, but these hurricanes will humble us as meteorologists. For example, with Irma, it was pretty clear for a lot of us that it was going to be an East Coast hurricane, and then suddenly there was a shift in the track. The high-pressure system north of it built in a little stronger and a little farther west, and that pushed the track farther west, and suddenly it became a West Coast storm. So we try to catch on to these, and that's why we track them and we watch them constantly, because every hour there are subtle changes in the tracks of these hurricanes, and if you're not watching it on a continual basis and tracking it like we were, they can catch you off guard. Luckily, a good day and a half prior to the storm shifting to that West Coast, we were able to give folks a warning because we had been watching it so closely. So the folks who on our storm mapping app who watch our forecasts and everything, they were able to get a little bit of a heads up on that shift. But then eventually, you know, the other places like the Hurricane Center, they caught on and they also adjusted their track. But they're extremely difficult to forecast. Very little subtle changes in the atmosphere that aren't modeled very well can have a dramatic effect on where these things go.
And of course, a very small change in the track can make a big difference to what the weather is like in any particular place. So, for instance, you know, the East Coast versus the West Coast of Florida, it's not a huge distance, but this slight change in the track made a big difference to the actual conditions, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You know, it puts you, you know, either on the good side of the hurricane, which is the left side, or the bad side, which is the right side of the semicircle. If you just cut a hurricane in half, the right half is the worst half. You know, that little change can put you either on the good side of the cane or the right bad side. And in this case, this hurricane was so large that even though it went up the West Coast or kind of inland along the West Coast, we had a massive storm surge in places like Jacksonville and Daytona and probably eventually later today in places like Savannah, Georgia. And that is because the onshore flow from the east flowing into that hurricane pushed that Atlantic water up. So this hurricane was very large, and it impacted a lot of people because of its size.
We've got a question here as well from Naomi, because one of the big impacts was the storm surge, and Naomi asks, how bad was the storm surge in Florida?
Yeah, it was expected to be very bad on the West Coast. The forecast models from yesterday morning showing that track just offshore, bringing all of that Gulf of Mexico water inland. We were expecting a 5 to as much as 15-foot storm surge along the West Coast. Now, there was a slight shift in the track at the last minute, and it tracked inland, and that spared most of the West Coast from the major storm surge. However, on the East Coast of Florida, which didn't really feel much of the strong winds and other things that the West Coast did, they did get the storm surge because of the wind around the hurricane always flowing in a counterclockwise direction because it's low pressure in the northern hemisphere. It pushed that Atlantic water up against those beaches and coastline there on the East Coast, and from Daytona Beach north, there was a pretty significant storm surge that I think caught some folks off guard.
Yeah, for our viewers, I'm just going to point out what you're talking about there, because that's exactly it. We've spoken already about how the East Coast was spared in a sense because, as you can see from our satellite picture, this storm moved towards the west coast in the end, but the winds around the hurricane moving in this anti-clockwise direction, just gathering up the water, piling it into that east coast. And Michael, I'm right in saying that one of the issues is that wind, that onshore wind into the east coast was sustained for quite some hours, wasn't it? And that's part of the problem.
Oh, absolutely. We were in Melbourne on Friday, and Friday night that wind started to blow. And it blew steadily, and it got stronger and stronger from Friday, Saturday, on into Sunday. So we had 3 good days of winds just blowing in the same direction over a long stretch of the ocean, and that's exactly what you need to get these big swells developing and eventually that storm surge piling up. And the storm surge is the number one killer in hurricanes. We talk about the wind and the damage the wind does, and everybody wants to focus on that eye and the wind, and sometimes they lose sight of the fact that you have this massive surge of water that comes in, and it can sweep buildings off their foundations, and it can cause big problems. And most people that die in hurricanes die in storm surge flooding.
So we've got another question from Emma, who asks, how long is the hurricane going to last? It's already been downgraded, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. It came on shore, and these hurricanes are big heat engines. They feed off the warm water of the oceans and the Gulf of Mexico in this case. And once they lose that heat source and that moisture source and they come over land, they typically rapidly weaken, and that's what this one did. It came on, I believe, at about 120 miles an hour, and now it's down to 70 mile an hour, and it'll continue to weaken fairly rapidly as it continues to move into Georgia. But what's interesting is these big hurricanes can also take time to wind down. And this one in particular is prompted tropical storm warnings as far north as where I live here in Atlanta, Georgia. And that's almost unheard of to have a tropical storm warning that far inland. So again, that just kind of is a testament to the size and strength of this hurricane. Even though it has weakened, it's still packing a huge punch. It's going to produce flooding rains, gusty winds up to 60, 70 miles an hour today in parts of Georgia and even Alabama, and numerous tornadoes also. That's another thing that doesn't get talked about much. These storms often produce a lot of tornadoes. We had a lot in Florida yesterday. We witnessed a couple ourselves, and they're going to produce several more tornadoes in Georgia today.
I'm just going to give you one more question before I let you go, Michael. We're talking to Michael Phelps, a meteorologist in the USA from Storm Mapping. I've got a question here from Dave, one of our viewers. And Dave asks, I'll be interested on your take on this, will we ever be able to control a hurricane?
I don't think we'll ever want to control a hurricane. If we did, then we would really mess up the whole climate, because these hurricanes are so necessary for the health of this planet, and here's why. The heat builds up in the tropics, and what these hurricanes do is they evacuate that heat out of the tropical regions and bring it poleward, and then you have Arctic fronts that bring cold air to the south. So it's just another one of the balancing acts that the Earth does to keep itself in such amazing balance and healthy. And if we lost our hurricanes and if we controlled them and we tried to get rid of them, then something else bad would happen to counteract it, to try to balance the atmosphere out. And, you know, it could be a tipping point. Maybe the atmosphere wouldn't be able to balance itself out at that point if hurricanes were controlled, and that would be bad news for humanity. So they're as bad as they are, and that's the fact. This is the fact with a lot of weather events. As bad as they are, they're necessary, and the problem is we as humans just get in the way of a necessary process.
Okay, Michael Phelps, a meteorologist in the USA, thank you very much for talking to us, giving us some fascinating answers to those questions, and stay safe where you are as you continue to track Tropical Storm Irma, as she now is, having weakened quite significantly over the recent hours. Now, just a couple more questions I want to get through from you. We had one question, if I can find it, somebody asking, here we are, Seamus, asking, will the hurricane Irma, or what's left of it at least, will it affect us here in the UK? Well, there's always a huge amount of uncertainty about what these tropical storms do next. But at the moment, it doesn't look like Irma will affect the UK directly. It will eventually get scooped up and pushed northwards. So if I take you to the forecast, you can see the way that over the next 24 hours, the remains of the storm still, with huge amounts of rain, drift northwards and eastwards across the USA. And then the question is what happens next? Well, at some stage, this leftover tropical moisture is likely to get picked up by the jet stream and taken away to the east, but still a lot of uncertainty about what will happen with that. And one more thing I want to mention before I go, because Irma may well be moving northwards and weakening, but we can't take our eyes off the Caribbean. It has become quite busy, quite an active storm season in the Atlantic, and I want to show you this, Hurricane Jose. Hurricane Jose, currently a Category 2 storm, not with the strength that Irma had earlier in its life. But the interesting thing about Jose is the forecast, because over the next few days it looks like it will meander quite aimlessly in the Atlantic, but then different computer weather models do different things with Hurricane Jose, and some options take it back towards the likes of the Bahamas, perhaps the Turks and Caicos, perhaps Cuba, perhaps Florida. A lot of uncertainty about that, but if we did see another bout of wet and windy weather, that would not be great news for those areas that are still continuing the cleanup from Irma. So this weather story will go on, and we'll keep you up to date here on the BBC. But that's it from us here on this Facebook Live. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.